Alright, this is my progress for the final project for the mobile app class. So for the actual upgrades that I've been able to implement, the first thing I did was add in two actual levels where the player will be able to go and traverse through using a player that I've created and put into the game. The packages slash concepts that I was able to use for this upgrade was basically just using tile.io. Basically going through there and actually figuring out how to create new levels, being able to add in different layers in the background. And as I said, I created two different levels, which I'm able to show here. So this is actually the first level that I made just for pretty standard right now. I'm going to be able to add in more obstacles that's going to be there, as well as different enemies that's going to be in, as well as different collectibles that the player can get. So right now you have this little gray square that is going to be where the player is. This is where the player will spawn in every time when you load into this level. Right here, these can be the three tiles that the player can actually stand on and can be able to walk across when the game first starts in. And as you can tell right here, I have two different layers. The second layer is actually the spawn point, which is where the player is actually going to spawn. So right here is going to be where the player is going to spawn in for each part when it's at level 1. And here is level 2 that I just started building out right now. Right here, I've made the spawn point go a bit further behind. So it's going to be over here. And I've added just another block over here because I'm going to eventually implement the player to actually be able to jump to different objects. So that's why there's two different blocks that are spaced out pretty far away from each other. So it took me about 2.5 hours to actually figure out how to work through tile.io, make sure I actually figured out how to actually use the different layers as well as implement spawn points that I had to put into the code, which I'll talk about later on. The second upgrade that I was doing was actually creating the player that the user was going to use, as well as giving them movement to be able to go across the screen. So I was able to add in a sprite that's going to be a playable character, as well as giving them inputs based off the user. And what I did for that was basically using a sprite animation, which was a class that was able to be used using Flame, which is the Flutter game engine that I'm using for this project. And it took about 4 hours to actually implement in the actual sprite that I use. I pulled that from the internet, I pulled the sprite, and then actually being able to get them to actually move and use their animations took a bit longer than I expected. So here is the app, what it looks like right now. This is the player on level 1. And right now, if you're able to actually click some of the buttons, you're able to actually get the person to move, to actually make them, when they're actually running a certain direction, it'll actually have them turn that direction. And if you actually hold both buttons down right now, you'll be able to use the left and right buttons to actually get them to move. So if you hold them both down at the same time, it causes the player to stop moving in total. And if you hold one of the buttons and they go in one direction, and he'll go all the way across the screen. And if you hold the other way, then it'll go across the other direction, all the way back here. And this is where they'll actually be able to spawn in. And right now I have different sprites that you're able to use, so I'll be able to go in the code and just change the name of a player, and that'll be able to create their sprite and come in. And if someone puts in a sprite that isn't one that I've already put in and implemented, then it will default to this sprite. The third thing I was doing was actually troubleshooting and changing my pubspec.yaml. I was able to actually get the characters to load in as well as the maps without it being able to not register, because for a while the PubSpec and YAML wasn't able to actually find any of the maps that I was implementing, and it kept saying that either the asset wasn't there or that it was empty. So it took me a while to actually figure out why it wasn't able to actually find it. I was able to find a workaround by using something called Flutter Clean. Basically, just I believe it just wiped the whole slate clean, basically, of any possible bugs that might have been implemented in. Went over through all my code and actually just did a refresh, and right now it's able to actually work. So I'm hoping that's going to stay that way throughout these next progress. It took basically around 4 hours for me to actually figure out what was going wrong. I was re-implementing and implementing different files, different images, making sure the assets were named correctly, changing the name of the assets. But once I was able to do Flutter Clean, it was able to actually just work fully and not have any too many bumps after that. So looking through, this was just some of the highlighted code that I've done for sprite animation to actually just get the player to move. This was basically doing an idle animation as well as a running animation. And this was what allowed the player just to be able to stand still when you're not pushing any buttons. That way the character can just stay stagnant and not actually move off the screen when he wants to. And going down a bit right here, this is where it will actually tell the player, the user, what to do. So if the left key is pressed and the right key is pressed, then nothing happens. If the left key is pressed, then the actual player direction would move to the left. And if it was pressed right, then we move to the right. And if nothing was pressed, then you'd actually be able to stay stagnant. And that's everything that I've been able to update through this progress.